Hello, we're going to talk about seams. We're going to discuss three different seams: the standard seam, the French seam, and the flat felled seam. The seam or construction stitching, a construction seam, is going to have a smaller stitch length, so about an average stitch length, and you'll back stitch at the beginning and the end. So that's what makes it a construction seam. Smaller stitch length, back stitch at beginning and end. For apparel sewing, we might sew about one and a half, possibly two. For costume sewing, I like to sew about two and a half or three. So that's around halfway in our 0 to 5 on this machine. If your machine only goes to 4, then you're going to look around 2. If your machine goes to 6, and you're looking at 3, a little longer. So between 2.5 and 3 is where I like to sew for costume sewing. So around your middle stitch length. Apparel sewing is going to be shorter. Basting, easing, or gathering stitches are going to be your longest stitch length. So for construction sewing, if we're just going by seam allowance, for this particular stitch, so we're going to start with our standard seam. And what you generally do, we're starting with two 6x6 squares of fabric just to practice with. But regardless, if it's a pattern piece or something to practice on, your standard seam, you're going to match your edges up as closely as you can to get those nice and even. You don't want it to be off, because if it's off like that, then what's happening is one of your pieces is now bigger or smaller than the other because they're not even. So we'll line up our edges and then we'll pin through the fabric. I like to pin perpendicular to the stitch. Some people like to pin parallel or with the stitch. It's up to you as far as I'm concerned which one you do. Just make sure if you're going parallel, you want to make sure that you put the pin in the direction so that you can pull it out as it's going through the fabric, through the machine. Because if you pin it this direction, as it's going through the machine, the head of the pin is up here. So you're having to go the opposite direction to pull that out. So it's just awkward. That's why I like to put the pins in perpendicularly so that I can pull them out from to the side as I go. In general, just to be safe, I like to pin every 2 to 3 inches. If it's an area you're a little concerned with, you might pin more. If it's long straight seam, you might pin less. I actually, at this point, I don't necessarily pin things, especially when they're straight seams like this, but especially when you're starting, the pins are even more important. So that's how we start our fabric. We prepare our seam by lining up the edges and pinning them together. Now, a standard seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch. Again, as we discussed in the construction chapter, unless you're told to sew a seam allowance other than 5/8, you need to assume that it's going to be 5/8 inch seam, because that's what the draper would have planned. That's what everybody is expecting is the standard. So if you sew more or less than that, then you're actually changing the size of the garment. So always 5/8 unless you're either told that it's a different seam allowance, or some drapers might draw a stitching line on the fabric, which essentially that indicates where you need to stitch. So instead of looking at your guides on your throat plate, you just make sure the needle is going into that line as you're sewing. So that would be a stitching line. And then it doesn't matter where the seam allowance is. You're still going to match what you would do is you would match up. You would pin parallel, because you would pin through the fabric to match up the stitching lines on either side. But for our purposes, we're not really going to be working with stitching lines. We're going to be working with our seam allowance. Now, if you want to know where 5/8 is and how to see it, on this machine, there are lines, and they may be hard to see from the camera, but when you're at the machine, you'll be able to see them better. There are little grooves in the throat plate, which is this piece here, that mark in 1/8 inch increments coming out from the foot. Our very first mark is right here along the edge of the foot, and that is actually 1/4 of an inch away from the needle. So our smallest marking is 1/4 of an inch, and then we go 1/8 of an inch up from there. So a little addition and subtraction of fractions, which you may not remember, but it's the way we work with these. In European and countries that use the metric system, they're going to be working in millimeters, but since we use the imperial system with inches, that's how we go. So if this is 1/4 inch, which is 1/4, and we add 1/8 to that, that is now 3/8 because 1/4 is actually 2/8. So we add another 8 and that's 3/8. We add another 8 and that's 4/8, which is 1/2 an inch. And then our next line is 5/8, which is our sewing, which is going to be our standard sewing guide. On this machine, the first 3 lines stop short and then the next lines go longer. Our 5/8 line, which I've put a little mark on this machine, is the first of the longer grooves. So that's how we know which one is the 5/8 on this machine. So when we sew, we're going to line the edge of our fabric up with this 5/8 inch guideline. And I'm going to turn the light on the machine off because I think it put a little more glare on here. It's harder. It looks like it's harder to see the grooves, but if you can see them, there they are, as described. So now we're ready to sew. We've got the machine on, we have it threaded, top thread, bobbin thread. We have our fabric prepped for our standard seam. Now, one of the things I did need to mention is this is a plain fabric, which is the same on front and back, so we don't have to worry about the face or the right side. However, if we are sewing, one of the things you're doing with your seam is you always want to have the right sides together or the face sides, right? Because what's going to happen is we're going to put our seam in here. And when we're working on basically the inside of the garment as we go. So these are the wrong sides that we're looking at, and the right sides or the face sides will be together. Put a little pattern on there. So the way we get started is we line the edge of our fabric up with that 5/8 inch line. We want to have the fabric starting so the needle's going in right at the very edge of the fabric. I like to start with the needle in just so I can make sure I'm very close to the edge. So we've got it ready to go. Now we need to put our presser foot down so we can engage our feed dogs. I'm going to take this pin out because you want to avoid sewing over pins. If this needle hits a pin, it can break the needle and or the pin, and it can either put those pieces into the machine, which could interrupt the timing and make the machine not operate well, or some of those pieces could go flying anywhere. So we don't want flying pieces of needle, and we don't want metal pieces down inside the machine. So you want to take your pins out as you come to them. So the first thing we're going to do, as I mentioned, the back stitch, right? So you just go forward about 2 or 3 stitches. So that's 3. And this is a place where you're trying to control it, so you might want to use the hand wheel because it'll move a little more slowly. You can control it better. But once we take those 3 stitches, 2 or 3, I usually do 2 actually, then we're going to raise our reverse stitch and press, and it's going to go back over those stitches to create our back stitch. So now we've got the ends of our fabric secure, of our seam secure, and now see, I'm not moving this through the machine, it's moving itself. What I'm doing is I'm just trying to guide the fabric so that the edge continues to line up with that 5/8 inch guide. So I might have to move it slightly from one side to another, and the slower you're going, the easier it is to control that, so that we keep an even, consistent seam from beginning to end. Now, as I come to the end here, I want to get as close to the edge of the fabric as possible. So for that last stitch, I'm going to use my hand wheel and then just backstitch a couple and come back off the end. Now, before I pull my fabric away, I've used my hand wheel to make sure my looper is back at the top. Now I'll lift my presser foot and then I can pull the fabric away from the machine. And then you'll just clip it right next to the fabric so we don't have any thread tails, and then we'll come back to the top where we started, where there's thread, and we clip that. This is the clip part of the sew, clip, press mantra. So now we've made our seam. So this is what the right side looks like. So this is the outside of the garment. We've just got this seam here, and the inside is where our seam allowance is. Now we want to press our seam allowance, and we want to press this open. So we're going to lie it with face down. We're going to open that seam up on the pressing board, take our iron, and press. I like to use a lot of steam. Now we've pressed our seam open and flat, and that makes our, so it looks like here, but it makes it look even nicer on the outside. All right, so that's sew, clip, press. So that's our standard seam. 5/8 of an inch, back stitch front and back, well, beginning and end, press the seam open, and that's, we start with, starting with right sides together, and that is our standard seam.